Hey guys, tonight we are exploring the far less glamorous side of medieval travel. Not knights, not gilded coaches, but the very real question of where your average slightly muddy peasant would sleep if they dared venture more than a few miles from home. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, the modern equivalent of livestock snoring in the next stall, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Leaving your village as a poor peasant in the Middle Ages was not something one did lightly. It was more like announcing to the world, I'm about to suffer recreationally. Because unlike nobles, with their squadrons of servants, horses, and backup shoes, you were likely walking barefoot with a sack full of anxiety and maybe an onion. Most peasants didn't travel far. Why would they? The village had everything. Bad bread, debt, religious guilt, and the same 7 people you'd known since birth. But if duty is called a pilgrimage, seasonal labor, or running from your landlord's henchmen, you packed your things. Things here, meaning a crust of bread, a rag cloak, and a stick for both walking and warding off geese. Journeys were long. Maps were for monks and pirates. If you didn't have a good sense of direction, you were basically just wandering until someone yelled at you in a different dialect. Distances were measured in how long until your feet start bleeding, and the number of times you consider sleeping in a bush. Before departure, you might ask your village priest for a blessing. Ideally, one that covered wolves, demons, bandits, dysentery, and overly curious farmers' daughters. If the priest liked you, he might even give you half a turnip and a worried look. Very supportive. Then came the goodbye ritual. A solemn wave from your grandmother who was 38 but looked 93. A warning from your cousin not to get eaten, and your younger siblings trying to steal the bread out of your pocket as a send-off gift. You walked, you trudged, you regretted everything. The road was muddy, filled with carts, animals, and the occasional knight who might trample you on principle. Every mile brought new questions. Am I lost? Is that man asleep or dead? And was this a bad idea? Yes, yes, and definitely yes. But still, you pushed on. Why? Because you had no choice? Or because your cousin said there was work in the next village? Or because a relic salesman said your sins would vanish if you walked to a monastery 3 days away? Spoiler, they didn't. And thus began your medieval journey, broke, barefoot, and with a level of optimism only possible before the blisters set in. So you've walked all day. Your feet are now more blister than flesh, and you've passed exactly 0 inns willing to house a penniless traveller who smells like damp thatch and existential regret. Time to consider the medieval peasant's most reliable shelter, the barn. Yes, the humble barn. A structure built for creatures with hooves, but frequently repurposed by creatures with poor life choices and no coin. Barns had everything a peasant could ever want in overnight accommodation. A roof, straw that wasn't entirely mouldy, and large flat animals that radiated warmth and judgment in equal measure. But don't just wander into any old barn. First, you must engage in the sacred ritual of asking the farmer, which involved knocking on the door and praying they were sober, not armed, and didn't already have 3 strangers sleeping in their loft. If they said yes, congratulations. You are now the proud guest of a cow, 6 chickens, and whatever rats hadn't left for the season. Sleeping in a barn was not without its perks. The straw was scratchy but better than dirt, and if you curled up between two docile oxen, your body temperature might actually rise above medieval corpse. Of course, if one of them rolled over, your travel plans might end permanently. There were also smells, deep layered emotional smells. Barns had a scent profile that ranged from fresh hay to barnyard cologne number 5. You didn't so much fall asleep as pass out from olfactory overload. And then came the sounds: pigs snorting, horses chewing, and the eternal rhythmic creaking of some wooden beam that definitely sounded like it was judging your life decisions. Add in the occasional flea circus performing beneath your shirt, and you had all the makings of a cozy rural nightmare. Still, beggars and peasants couldn't be choosers. A barn meant you wouldn't freeze to death, get rained on, or be devoured by a nocturnal wildlife. And come dawn, you might even get a chunk of stale bread as thanks for not stepping on the goose. In the grand hierarchy of peasant lodging, a barn sat squarely between miracle and wet log, and compared to what's next on the list, sleeping outdoors, it was practically a 5-star inn. So the barn door was locked, the monastery turned you away, and the local innkeeper laughed so hard at your empty coin pouch he nearly choked on his own spit. That means only one thing. Tonight, dear traveller, you're sleeping outdoors. Let's start with the field. A classic, flat, spacious, full of grass and cows. Lots of cows. You might find a soft patch to lie on, assuming it's not already claimed by cow dung or thistles, which were Mother Nature's medieval equivalent of bedbugs. If you were smart, or just cowardly enough to avoid angry farmers, you aimed for the edge of a field. That way, you minimized the risk of being trampled by livestock or chased off by a man named Godric wielding a pitchfork and personal grudges. Then there were forests, an excellent option if you wanted your sleeping experience to include paranoia. Forests were quiet, yes, but in the way haunted houses are quiet. Every twig snap became a murder mystery. Every owl hoot sounded sarcastic. You didn't sleep so much as enter a shallow coma with one eye open. Plus, medieval forests were full of charming characters like wolves, bandits, and if you asked the local priest, probably Satan himself. The wind through the trees could be soothing, but also suspicious. If you made it through the night without frostbite or tooth marks, you considered it a win. Still, some peasants actually preferred the open air, especially in warmer months. The stars were free to look at, unlike everything else, and the breeze helped mask the smell of your own unwashed body. Sure, it was damp, cold, and offered zero protection from bugs the size of regret, but at least no one charged you rent. To create a bit of comfort, some travellers carried cloaks or old blankets, emphasis on old. Most were made of rough wool, smelled like regret, and had the insulating power of a slice of cabbage. If you curled up into a fetal position and muttered prayers to Saint whoever was on duty, you might even sleep for a few hours. Let's say you've already been turned away from the tavern because you couldn't afford a mug of watered-down ale, or the landlord didn't appreciate your aura of hopeless poverty. You've tried the fields, the forests, the barns, and now you're eyeing the one place that might offer both peace and a lower risk of being kicked in the ribs by a goat: the churchyard. Yes, Welcome to sanctified sleeping, the hallowed ground where the righteous rest in eternal peace. And you, the traveling peasant, try to get a few hours without accidentally rolling into a grave. Churchyards were surprisingly popular among the itinerant peasant class. Why? Because they were public, semi-protected, and the dead rarely complained. Sleeping near holy ground was thought to provide spiritual protection, or at the very least discourage bandits. After all, even the most hardened thief might think twice before robbing someone within sneeze distance of a saint's femur. Of course, there were risks. Local clergy didn't always appreciate vagrants turning their graveyards into medieval campgrounds. You might be awakened by a furious monk or a nun with a broom and zero patience. And if it was near a feast day or market, you weren't alone. The churchyard could resemble a crowded slumber party for the deeply uncomfortable and unwashed. Still, there were perks. Some churches had sheltered porches called lich gates, where travellers could sleep relatively dry, assuming the wind didn't treat your blanket like an open invitation to misery. And there was always the hope that a kindly priest might take pity on you and offer some soup or bread, especially if you looked particularly tragic or had a good sob story involving sick goats. If it rained, the graves offered a kind of ironic comfort. "At least I'm not that guy," you'd mutter, curled next to a mossy stone, soaked but alive. Nothing like sleeping atop the departed to really drive home how much worse things could be. And who knows, maybe you'd absorb some residual holiness through proximity, or just fleas from the grass. Either way, it beat fighting over a dry patch of mud in the alley behind the butcher's stall. Churchyards, because sometimes divine intervention looks like a mossy bench and a stern warning from Father Gregory when you were too broke for an inn, too cold for the woods, and too emotionally fragile to sleep next to a corpse in a churchyard. There was one last bastion of hope: the monastery. Yes, the solemn stone sanctuaries of men who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and regrettable haircuts. These were places where weary travellers might find a meal, a floor, and a solid 8 hours of being silently judged by men who voluntarily gave up shoes. Now, let's be clear. Monasteries were not medieval bed and breakfasts. You didn't just waltz up and ask for a room with a view and a side of mead. You waited politely at the gate, often for hours, until a monk decided you weren't a heretic, a bandit, or worst of all, a talkative heretic. If you passed this test, you'd be admitted under the ancient rule of hospitality. Treat the stranger as Christ, which sounds lovely, until you realize it also meant cold floors, shared soup, and being woken at 3 o'clock a.m. by chanting that sounded like Gregorian monks arguing with bees. Monks fed you what they ate, mostly bread, watery vegetables, and something pretending to be broth. If it had a flavor, it was probably penance. But after a day of chewing on air and disappointment, even boiled leeks felt like a feast. Just don't ask for seconds. That's how you get extra prayers instead of extra portions. Sleeping accommodations varied. Some monasteries had dedicated guest halls, which is a generous term for a long room with benches, hay, and the faint scent of damp wool and sanctity. You'd sleep among strangers, all trying not to cough too loudly and anger the friar with a broom. If the monastery was poor or overcrowded, you might be told to sleep in the cloister, essentially a stone hallway with spiritual acoustics and wind that whistled the dies irae. Still, monks didn't ask for money. All they expected in return was that you didn't steal anything, didn't blaspheme near the relics, and maybe confess your sins, which after 5 nights outdoors probably included envy, wrath, and thinking about murdering a chicken. Was it luxurious? No, but it was dry, quiet, and came with just enough guilt to keep you humble. So your feet are blistered, your shoes gave up 2 villages ago, and the barn owl you tried to share a tree with last night nearly pecked your nose off. Welcome to the real medieval Airbnb, the roadside shrine. These weren't grand cathedrals or even modest chapels, more like holy vending machines, little stone or wooden structures, sometimes containing a statue of the Virgin Mary, a local saint, or a chunk of something someone swore was once part of a martyr's femur. Positioned at crossroads or along pilgrimage routes, they serve 2 main purposes: to inspire piety and to provide just enough cover for a nap without being rained on. For poor peasants on the move, these shrines became sacred snooze booths. If you were lucky, the overhang would be big enough to sit under, even better to huddle with your knees to your chest and pretend that damp stone was a mattress. And while shrines didn't offer food, bedding, or bathrooms, they did offer one priceless thing: plausible deniability. If someone found you snoring at the foot of St. Mildred, you could always claim to be praying loudly in your sleep. Now, of course, not every shrine welcomed freeloading travelers. Some were lovingly maintained by villagers who didn't appreciate your muddy presence, ruining the aesthetic. But others were so remote that even the squirrels had forgotten them. For a weary traveler, that was basically 5-star luxury. It helped that no one wanted to rob a shrine. Bad luck, you see. Bandits might risk their souls for a merchant's pouch, but they drew the line at stealing next to a painted icon of St. Jerome with laser eyes and a passive-aggressive smirk. There was also a spiritual side. Sleeping near a shrine gave you that faint sense of moral safety, as if the saint would personally intervene if something tried to eat you. Of course, this wasn't guaranteed. St. Hubert might protect you from werewolves, but probably not from trenchfoot or aggressive squirrels. And yet, despite the cold, the rocks, and the faint smell of damp holiness, roadside shrines remained a favoured fallback. Not because they were comfortable, but because they weren't worse. By the 7th blister, the 15th, no room, go away. And the 3rd time you were chased out of a barn by a donkey with boundary issues, you start to fantasize about a real bed, or at least a roof or soup. That's when the warm, flickering glow of an alehouse window starts to look less like a building and more like a divine apparition with beer breath. Alehouses and taverns were the medieval version of the truck stop. Cheap drinks, questionable company, and enough body heat inside to steam up a window with sheer collective regret. But for the travelling peasant, they were also one of the few indoor options where you didn't have to pretend to be holy or fluent in monk. Let's get one thing straight. You couldn't just walk in and sleep on the bench. If you had coin, you were welcome. If you didn't, well, the door had a wonderful creak to it as it slammed in your face. The drink was the star of the show. Ale, beer, mead, whatever the local yeast could be convinced to ferment. Many a peasant would order a single cup and nurse it for hours, hoping to avoid being thrown out. Sometimes the more charitable innkeepers allowed weary travellers to sleep by the hearth for the price of a drink and a story. Other times they charged a few pennies for a straw bed in a corner, shared, of course, with whoever else had enough change and body odour. Privacy was a fantasy. You'd sleep shoulder to shoulder with strangers who snored like war horses and mumble confessions in their sleep. The floor was sticky, the benches uneven, and the fireplace smoke a constant reminder that oxygen is a luxury. But it was warm, and if you closed your eyes tight enough, you could pretend the rats were just small, curious cats. Sometimes there were songs, sometimes fights, occasionally both at once. But even amid the shouting and spilled ale, there was a strange comfort in it all, a reminder that you were still part of the grand, grimy flow of humanity. Taverns, where warmth cost money, but sleep came free with enough ale. Picture this, it's getting dark. The wolves are howling, or maybe just some very aggressive sheep, and your options are down to sleep in a puddle or knock on the door of a stranger who probably hasn't had a bath since Easter. Time to activate the peasant's final survival strategy, begging for shelter. This wasn't quite the modern Airbnb experience. There were no reviews, no app, and certainly no fresh linens. It was more like a roulette wheel with fleas. You picked a house that didn't look too murdery, walked up humbly, and pleaded with whoever answered the door for a place by the fire. If you were lucky, the owner would take pity on your blistered feet and let you in. If you were unlucky, they'd let the dog answer instead. Some families, especially in rural areas, were more hospitable. Maybe they remembered what it was like to travel, or maybe they just liked the gossip that came with hosting a stranger. A good story was worth more than a hot bath after all. Mostly because no one remembered what hot baths were. You'd usually be given the least offensive corner of the house, near the hearth if you were lucky, near the goat pen if you weren't. Bedding ranged from straw and an old cloak to a suspiciously crunchy pile of rags, but at least it was indoors. You might even get a meal, a hunk of bread, maybe some root vegetable stew, and water that didn't glow in the dark. In return, you were expected to behave like a saint. No stealing, no eyeing the daughter, and definitely no suspicious noises after curfew. You were also expected to be up and gone by sunrise, lest you overstay your welcome and transition from grateful guest to suspicious squatter. Of course, this all relied on trust, which in the medieval world was about as sturdy as a three-legged stool in a thunderstorm. But somehow it worked. Communities took pride in their occasional generosity, and travellers learned the fine art of being humble, thankful, and invisible by morning. It wasn't glamorous, but it beat sleeping in a ditch with judgmental frogs. There comes a point in every peasant's journey when desperation meets innovation. The night is too cold, the barn is full of angry cows, and the shrine has already been claimed by someone who snores like a demon gargling gravel. What's left? The marketplace. By day, medieval markets were a chaotic symphony of shouting vendors, twitchy animals, questionable cheese, and the occasional pickpocket who thought subtlety was optional. But by night, a ghost town littered with empty stalls, overturned carts, and maybe a half-eaten turnip if you were lucky. In other words, prime real estate. The wooden stalls were often just frames with thatched or cloth roofs, more decorative than weatherproof. But they did offer shelter from wind and rain. And if you didn't mind the smell of onions and old fish, and honestly, if you were a medieval peasant, you didn't. They were perfectly adequate for a night's sleep. Just tuck yourself under the counter, wrap up in whatever sack you were using as a coat, and try not to dream about roast meat. There was also a strategic benefit. Markets were central. They were near roads, churches, taverns, and occasionally, if you were in a fancy town, a public latrine that only smelled mildly hellish. Sleeping there gave you a head start in the morning, up with the sun, gone before the fishmongers arrived, swinging slabs of trout like disciplinary tools. Of course, there were risks. Some towns had night watchmen who didn't take kindly to unlicensed snoozing. If caught, you might be scolded, kicked awake, or worse, asked to explain yourself using complete sentences. And then there were the animals, stray dogs, opportunistic rats and geese. Never underestimate medieval geese. They were loud, territorial, and had a personal vendetta against anything that moved. Still, it beat sleeping in the mud, and sometimes vendors would even leave behind scraps or stale bread, too crusty for customers, but just right for someone who hadn't chewed anything solid since Tuesday. Market sheds weren't built for comfort, but they were there. They were mostly dry, and best of all, they didn't ask questions. In the medieval world, there was one kind of travel that came with a mildly increased chance of sleeping indoors. Pilgrimage. Say you were off to Canterbury, Santiago, or some obscure saint's elbow bone shrine in the middle of nowhere. Congratulations. You just unlocked medieval travel's only loyalty program. Pilgrim hostels, also called hospitia, xenodokia, or just the place that smells like sandalwood and feet, were religious guest houses specifically for the holy wanderer. Run by monks, nuns, or locals trying to score points with heaven, these places offered shelter, soup, and the sweet promise of not dying in a ditch. All you needed was a pilgrim's badge, a little token or emblem proving that you were indeed walking for Jesus and not just avoiding your landlord. These badges were the medieval equivalent of a backstage pass. Wear one and doors might just open. Forget one and you were just another vagrant with sore feet and suspicious eyes. Inside the hostel, luxuries varied. You might get a straw mattress, a wool blanket, or, if you really struck spiritual gold, a shared bed in a drafty upper room. Clean sheets, hilarious. Privacy? That's for nobles and heretics. But it was warmish, dryish, and the food, while often just soup that waved at a vegetable, was freeish. Monks were usually the hosts, which meant a few things. Prayer at dawn, silence at supper, and absolutely no funny business. Pilgrims were expected to behave like saints, even if they smelled like goats. If you were caught stealing, lying, or flirting too enthusiastically with the icon of St. Cuthbert, you'd be out faster than a heretic at a bonfire. Still, for the weary poor, pilgrim hostels were a blessing. one of the few places you could count on some measure of safety and care. There were little sanctuaries on the winding road of medieval chaos. The takeaway? If you had sore feet, spiritual angst, and a convincing story about a vision involving the Virgin Mary and 3 geese, you could rest easy, at least for one night. Ah, the medieval noble estate, home to fine tapestries, roast swan, courtly intrigue, and a backyard full of peasants trying to sleep discreetly next to the manure heap. Yes, for the particularly bold traveller, noble lands offered opportunity, so long as you understood your place, and that place was very much behind the stables. Now, you weren't exactly strolling up to the castle and asking for a room. That sort of thing got you crossbowed. But noble estates were vast. Manor houses, fields, storehouses, livestock pens, and crucially, outbuildings. The stables, granaries, lofts, and tool sheds provided cover, warmth, and if you were lucky, a goat that didn't mind company. If you had a good sob story and the luck to catch a charitable steward, you might even be granted official permission to stay briefly. Nobles like to show off their Christian piety now and then, and allowing a peasant not to freeze to death was one of the less expensive ways to earn divine favor. But let's be honest, most peasants didn't ask. They skulked. They found a low wall, a patch of dry grass, or the lee of a building, and curled up like a guilty hedgehog. Behind the stables was a favorite, warm from the animals, shielded from wind, and bonus, nobody wanted to hang out near horse leavings at night anyway. Instant privacy. Risks abounded, of course. If a guard spotted you, you might be chased off or roughed up, depending on how bored he was. If the noble was particularly paranoid, you might be accused of being a poacher, a thief, or just too scruffy to be tolerated. And if the livestock didn't like you, well, let's just say being kicked by a medieval donkey was a character-building experience. Still, for the desperate, noble lands were tempting. They had resources, fences, and a tendency to leave things lying around unsupervised. Just don't touch the apples or the pigs or the fence or anything really. Be invisible, be quiet, and move on before dawn. Because nothing ruins a noble's breakfast quite like discovering an unconscious peasant snoring behind the compost pile. In the great medieval game of where can I sleep without dying or paying, abandoned buildings were the jackpot. Sure, they were collapsing, full of rats, and almost certainly cursed. But did we mention they were free? The beauty of an abandoned cottage, burnt-out smithy, or ruined mill was that no one cared. Nobles didn't send guards after you. Monks didn't expect you to pray. And tavern keepers didn't charge you a kidney for a bowl of gruel. If you could get past the gaping holes in the roof and the unsettling whispers when the wind blew through the rafters, you were golden. These structures were often relics of better, or at least less plague-ridden times. A village abandoned during the Black Death. Ghost town. A watchtower no longer needed because the invading horde got bored. Empty and scenic. That old bathhouse that burned down after someone lit a candle near the oils. Smelled weird, but hey, 4 walls are 4 walls. Peasants didn't ask questions. They saw a roof, partial, a door, optional, and floor space, rat-infested, but still space. You stuffed some straw in a corner, maybe used your sack as a pillow, and hoped the spirit of whatever peasant died there before you was feeling generous. Of course, medieval superstition didn't help. Everyone knew abandoned places were haunted. That's why they were abandoned. Wailing noises? Must be a ghost. Cold draft? Ghost. Creepy goat staring through the window at 3 a.m.? Probably a ghost. But also probably just a goat. Probably. Still, if you were poor and traveling, haunted buildings were often safer than sleeping out in the open. They offered shelter from rain, wind, wolves, and worse, other humans. And occasionally they came with forgotten tools, a bit of leftover grain, or firewood left behind by a previous squatter, who either found better lodgings or was eaten by the chimney spirit. You didn't brag about staying in these places. You didn't make eye contact with them in daylight. But when night fell and you were cold, alone, and one sore ankle away from collapsing, an abandoned hovel was a gift from the gods, or at least from someone who wasn't coming back. In the grand tapestry of medieval life, stitched with famine, plague, and people tossing chamber pots out of windows, there existed, believe it or not, the occasional kind stranger. Not often, mind you, but every once in a while, a peasant traveler hit the lottery and met someone who didn't immediately treat them like lice in human form. These rare individuals came in various shapes. An old widow who remembered what it was like to be poor, a tired farmer who had an extra crust of bread and a half-cleared barn, or a pious merchant who genuinely believed Matthew 25:35 wasn't just decorative Latin. Whatever the reason, they saw a stranger, raised an eyebrow and said, "All right, you can sleep near the pig." No one expected a feather bed or roasted goose, but a roof, a fire, and something vaguely edible that was a medieval miracle. In return, the peasant usually offered to chop wood, fetch water, or pretend to understand the host's complaints about the tax collector. Of course, not every kind stranger was purely altruistic. Sometimes kindness came with a request. Watch the kids, scare off wolves, help fix a wheelbarrow that last saw maintenance during the Crusades. Still, it was a fair trade compared to being mugged by bandits or eaten by wild dogs. The danger, naturally, was that not every stranger who looked kind was. There were scams, traps, and the occasional innkeeper who'd let you sleep under his roof, then accidentally forget to mention the lice infestation until you'd already started scratching. But those were just the risks of the road. Word of mouth helped. Villagers whispered names of good folk. Old Martin near the river, Brother Anselm 2 valleys over, that weird shepherd with a soft spot for travellers and sheep alike. These weren't hostels. They were whispers of hope scattered across the map like breadcrumbs. So yes, sometimes the desperate traveller found a fire, a bowl of stew, and a smile that didn't look suspicious. And in a world where trust was as rare as fresh bread in February, that meant everything. Just don't overstay your welcome. Even kindness had a checkout time. Let's clear one thing up right away. When we say poor peasants slept with animals, we're talking about proximity, not passion. This isn't 50 Shades of Hay. It's about survival. Cold, damp, wheezing in the dark survival. Because when winter came knocking, and the only thing between you and hypothermia was a pig named Marjorie you cuddled up and tried not to think about the smell. Animals were medieval central heating. Cows, sheep, goats, and pigs radiated warmth like big, wheezing radiators that occasionally tried to eat your bedding. In many peasant homes, especially those humble enough to qualify as livestock inclusive, there wasn't much of a separation between living quarters and barn. The pig got one corner, you got the other, and the chicken wandered wherever it wanted because no one had the energy to argue with it. On the road, it was no different. Sleep near an ox cart? You've got wind protection and 2,000 pounds of beefy body heat. Find a roadside farm and charm your way into the barn. That's deluxe accommodation compared to sleeping under a tree with a wet sock and a grudge. Even a drafty goat shed beat shivering alone in the woods. Unless the goat was territorial. Some were. You learned that the hard way. Sure, there were drawbacks. Lice, fleas, questionable smells, midnight noises that made you rethink your life choices. But in the peasant economy of shelter, beggars couldn't be sniffy. And if you could manage not to roll into the cow's personal space and get kicked into next week, it was a surprisingly effective survival strategy. Occasionally, you even bonded with the animals. That sheep that didn't trample your foot, she was your new best friend. The donkey that didn't bite when you leaned on it for warmth, practically family. The pig that snorted at your snoring but let you stay, a saint. Sleeping with animals wasn't just common. It was smart, practical, and in many ways more dependable than humans. Animals didn't judge your patched tunic, ask invasive questions, or demand coins you didn't have. They just existed, snorted, and kept you warm, which in the grand medieval scheme of things made them excellent roommates. So you made it. You trudged through mud, slept beside goats, begged bread crusts from strangers, got sneezed on by monks, and maybe didn't get robbed every night. Congratulations. Now you get to do it all over again in reverse. The return journey for a poor peasant wasn't some glorious homecoming. It was more like retracing your own bad decisions, while slightly more dehydrated and 30% more lice-infested. You weren't just tired. You were spiritually, emotionally, and physically deflated, like a wine bladder that's been stepped on by a mule. And yet somehow, you were wiser. Not in the way nobles are wise after reading Cicero by a fire. No, you were peasant wise. You knew which barns had the soft hay, which roadside shrines didn't reek of goat urine, and which taverns had innkeepers who didn't water down the ale too much. You even had a mental map of which dogs bite and which just bark. Your expectations had also adjusted. Before, you were optimistic enough to think someone might offer you a bed. Now you saw a dry ditch and thought, luxury. That soggy loaf of bread you traded for your last wooden spoon. Best deal I've made all week. And that monk who offered you soup and a 45-minute lecture on sin. At least it was warm. Perhaps the most painful part was knowing that no one back home would believe a word of it. Oh sure, they'd say. You slept in a churchyard, dined on beetroot soup with Benedictines, and avoided a plague outbreak by hiding under a broken wagon. Right. But in your lice-bitten, blister-ridden heart, you knew you'd survived the medieval road. You'd faced hunger, cold, and awkward silences with donkeys. You'd made it through the medieval hospitality lottery and lived to tell the tale, though you'd probably wait until after a bath. The journey changed you. Your tunic was torn, your dignity mildly eroded, and your feet, best not to talk about your feet, but your worldview was broader. You knew the kindness of strangers, the utility of goats, and the spiritual redemption of sleeping in places you swore you'd never mention again. You left as a peasant. You returned as, well, still a peasant, but one with stories. And that's something.